So I'd like to introduce John. He's currently in the position of Supervising Environmental Health Specialist for the County of San Diego Department of Environmental Health, Hazardous Materials Division. He's been in that position since 1998. Prior to that, he was Deputy Chief of the county's Hazmat Division from 90 to 98. He's worked for the County of San Diego Department of Environmental Health since 1986, 1 year longer than me, in various environmental enforcement positions. He graduated with a BS degree in environmental health from San Diego State University in 1983 and a master's degree in public administration from Cal State University at Fullerton in 1988. He's a registered environmental health specialist for the California Department of Public Health since 1985. Mr. Misleh has 27 years of experience in hazardous material and hazardous waste regulations and compliance inspections, and he really knows what he's talking about. I just wanted to share my experience with this class. I was letting him know that even though he's been teaching this class for how long?
Three times.
He's taught it for at least three different opportunities, and I've missed them until this year. And we were discussing the fact that a lot of CUPAs aren't aware that this is a regulation, a federal regulation that hasn't been implemented because, I don't know why, for one reason or another, but I just wanted to mention that we're one of those that is just now beginning to understand this. And so this is going to be videotaped. You can use it as a training opportunity for your staff. Make sure we get out there and learn this information. See, my staff is here. Here she is. She's going to start. She's going to be our training officer. So enjoy. Thank you. Oh, wait, let's think.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. Well, good morning. I'll kind of wander around and hopefully get some interaction from you guys in the audience. How many have ever had to deal with Subpart BB or Subpart CC, Rcra air emissions for Lqgs? Okay, some business. How many regulators in here? Inspectors? And industry? Consultants? Okay, so about half and half. Okay, that's good. I've been interested in this for several years. Surprisingly, the state and EPA, at least in California, hasn't really done a lot of training on this I'm aware of in Southern California. So I took it upon myself, since I do the Lqgs in San Diego, and I help train the inspectors in our group, to go ahead and learn this rule. I think it's really important. You know, as inspectors, industry, we're focused on liquids and solids, what goes in the container, what goes in the drum, what label, accumulation time limits, the basic generator standards. This one's a little bit more advanced. They're very important for Rcra air emissions to be met and for inspectors to start enforcing it. So we're consistent and standardized and not one region is doing it. In San Diego, we've been doing it for several years. We've done minor enforcement cases. We're giving businesses some time to learn the rule. We help them out with some guides and things like that. But I have some case studies in San Diego that I'll be sharing with you. There's been Region 9 enforcement in California for Lqg Rcra companies that haven't met the Subpart BB and CC standards. And I'll go through all those requirements in great detail. This is kind of an advanced course, so if you're new to hazardous waste, it may be a little bit overwhelming, but learning it early and relearning it again and looking at the regs, it's important because they're complicated. So this is sort of advanced, and I tell people that I give this training to that it is really for the intermediate, more advanced inspectors. All of our PBR sites, places that are doing treatment, Lqg Rcra, we kind of have our senior inspectors do the inspection, so it makes a fit for when we do training of them. Some are in the audience, so. The course outline, we're going to be talking about the applicability of this regulation. It is adopted by California in 1998. It's a federal rule. We'll give examples. We'll give an overview of Subpart BB, which is called a leak detection and repair program, mainly for equipment. Piping runs, pipes and pumps, valves, connectors. That's what BB covers. Subpart CC is for tanks and containers. Affects a lot of Lqg Rcra generators that have VOC waste, and we'll talk about the definitions in just a bit. And then I made a guide a few years ago that's actually uploaded, about 60-page guide for industry as well as for business consultants to kind of follow the California rule. And I put the particular sections of Title 22 into the guide, page by page, based on equipment, based on whether it is a Subpart BB or Subpart CC. We all know vapors can be dangerous. 3 people killed in Texas, early 2000s. They're offloading a tanker full of flammable liquid waste at oil production facility for waste condensate, and it ignites and kills 3 people. It's the vapors typically that are going to be harmful whenever you're transferring volatile organics, whenever there's an escape of vapors. And they can, obviously, there's been a lot of examples where the vapors have caused injury, usually burning or death in this case. So it's a very, very famous one. I mean, it's one where the Chemical Safety Board, the national program, did a study on this, all the things that went wrong, and it really was because of no vapor control being ignited by an ignition source nearby. So it's not just 10, 15 years ago, it's happening today. In Hanford, Washington, the Attorney General is suing the DOE and Hanford, where all the mixed waste is. There's about 170 tanks of mixed waste, a lot of VOC waste and radioactive waste. And the workers that have been trying to treat this stuff and stabilize it at Hanford, they've been getting sick from the vapors coming from the tanks. And so the state of Washington's not happy with DOE and with US EPA and the national, the Hanford people that ran the facility. Finally, they're going to take a Rcra lawsuit to try and force them to manage the vapors, control the emissions, because people are getting sick. And they've been getting sick for several years because they've been trying to clean that place up or stabilize the mixed waste for over 20 years, because they're all sitting in these old underground tanks. Many of them are leaking, and many of them are single wall. Okay. Oops. Like I mentioned, EPA has done some enforcement. They went to Ventura County a few years ago. Biotechs are ones where, at least in San Diego and other parts of California, they use a lot of solvent, volatile organics. And they go in, and if they're Rcra Lqg and they have a volatile organic, EPA does what's called a consent decree or consent order. There's several of these that you can look online if you look in California where they've gone out and done it. I haven't seen too many in San Diego. That the ones in San Diego we've done have been just the CUPA. But they typically go out there, find out the company has a lot of volatile organic waste with no emissions control, and the EPA calls it low-hanging fruit. It's a violation that's really easy to cite if there's no records or nobody's aware of it. These regulations go back to the 1990s. Again, hazardous waste was something that was regulated by Rcra. But some of the emissions from facilities were a concern to neighboring because of the odors that were coming from these facilities, the ozone precursors, ones that destroy ozone, and then the air toxic pollutants, things that cause the cancer and things like that. What EPA did is they first made the rule for TSDs, and then they expanded the rule to Lqg Rcra generators, so in the whole country. And then all the Rcra authorized states required to enforce the rule or adopt the rule, which California did in 1998. So it's been on the books for a lot of years. So it goes through some simple regulations, but what is a volatile organic? For a lot of the businesses here, they kind of understand what it is, but here's the legal definition in the regulation for volatile organics using it. The typical Rcra hazardous waste that are volatile organics, things like the spent Rcra solvents, your F-listed, the D001 flammable waste, aliphatic hydrocarbons, and then chlorinateds, and then some Rcra TCLP organics, and there's others. When I do an inspection, and I know it's a Rcra Lqg, I'll look at manifest, I'll look at waste profiles, I'll look at LDRs, figure out they got a VOC. It's pretty easy to do. I usually do that, and inspectors will do that in the office using the hazardous waste tracking system, looking at manifest, looking at D001, look at their status as a Rcra Lqg in SIRS, because that's one of the questions for business activities in SIRS, and the rule is going to apply. There's not many exemptions in California for this rule. Vapors are everywhere in production, manufacturing. You're going to have vapors from tanks coming out through vent pipes, here, through condensers. I've inspected condensers at steam strippers and air strippers in San Diego that are treating wastewater with organics. You can have it from valves, from tanks here. So vapors are pretty much in all manufacturing if there's a flammable liquid being used or applied. Next 20 slides or so, I want to give you examples of some pictures from some inspections we do in San Diego. This is one we did just a few months ago. Biotech, this machine here generates some waste solvent, goes down to the floor, I'll show you in a second. And then the piping for liquid waste goes up through the ceiling of the facility, and they have a PVC vent for the vapors from the production equipment. That PVC vent is vapors from production, not regulated under Subpart BB or CC, because it's coming from a manufacturing process unit. Think of it as like an auto body shop spray painting auto body paint. Those emissions are controlled by Air Pollution Control District, not by these rules, because it's manufacturing solvent that's actually being evaporated off. These rules deal with waste, and the waste tanks, waste piping. So this unit right here, it says the waste is the unit that we regulate under the rule. When I did the inspection in November, I looked at this PVC and I looked at the chemical composition, and I said, are you guys sure PVC is compatible with your waste solvent? And it isn't. And this is going right through the ceiling up to the roof. So now they're going to revise that or redo that piping, the PVC piping, because when they ran the chemical compatibility, it dissolves PVC. The solvent, methylene chloride, was the chlorinated. So it's twice I've seen biotechs put PVC piping in with methylene chloride being one of the solvents, and it says if you do run a compatibility, it's do not use PVC. And I referred it to Air Pollution Control District as well. So from the machine, the actual solvent went down to this little 2.5-gallon stainless or steel container. And this is all the piping and the pump. And this pumping took it back up to here. So this is the pump they used. So the volume was continuous. They did 9,000 gallons a year of waste solvent. And they were in production. This company had, I think, peptide manufacturing, peptide synthesis. They would transfer it from this little pump through some flexible piping that was double-walled out to the totes in the 90-day area. Close up on the pump. The metal tag was a good indicator that this company knew about the air emissions rule, because you're required to actually tag your equipment with identifying equipment markers. So that was really a good indication when I first looked down and saw it that they had a clue about this rule. It's a national company, so they've had Subpart BB and Subpart CC inspections in other parts of the country from other regulators. Ultimately, that pump took it out here to their 90-day area, and it dropped into an activated, the vapors dropped into an activated carbon drum, incoming and outgoing. What caught my attention was, they had no label on it for activated carbon. This is to control the vapors coming from the totes. And then they had a little pipe that was connected to an exhaust system. So what they kind of developed was they wanted something to suck the vapors from the totes over to activated carbon and treat the vapors like the rule requires. It's called a control device. Activated carbon is very common. But they put a little vacuum on it by putting it into an exhaust system. So I was a little concerned about that. I saw that they had metal tags hanging from everything. Again, a good indicator that they're complying with the air rule. But I was concerned that they were possibly, as they pulled a vacuum in and out to suck the vapors out to the roof up here, that they were saturating the carbon, and it actually did occur. The activated carbon was getting saturated. They did a performance design of 1 year. They would have to change out that activated carbon. It was being saturated within 6 months. So one of the violations they were given was they had actually saturated this drum, and they were getting no longer 95% collection of vapors, which is the rule. So 95% of the vapors need to be collected or absorbed in the carbon. They saturated it way quicker. But they purposely have this vacuum by the engineer to kind of do a draw the vapors to here. A lot of the regulations that I'm talking about are found, EPA has a really good website to look up the regulations for air emissions. So I put the web. Applicability is Rcra Lqgs, so your 90-day hazardous waste generators. Got to be Rcra waste. Containers that are more than 27 gallons in size. We'll go through that a little bit later in more detail. And the regulations are found here in California. Like I said, they adopted these regulations in 1998. The feds call this Subpart AA and BB and CC. California calls it articles. So when I refer to AA, BB, and CC, it's really the articles in Title 22 California Code of Regulations. Okay. And real important, if you're a generator or inspector, you don't apply these rules to non-Rcra waste. It's got to be Rcra waste. So it doesn't affect non-Rcra generators for California only hazardous waste, which is a kind of a relief for a lot of businesses. We don't have very many Rcra Lqgs, but I'll go through some examples in further detail. We made a guide in San Diego. I haven't revised it. It's pretty much the rule has been static since 1998, so it's still valid. Can you use it? Again, I uploaded it to the website, and we have it on our county website as well for the CUPA in San Diego. When I looked at the EPA regulations, they were so confusing, and California adopted them. A big part of transferring it and making a guide was just pretty much making sure the regulations, the numbers matched or corresponded, and that was the big time-consuming task, because California has their own numbering system, of course, and their own reference, Title 22. Some of the examples we'll go through. Navy training torpedoes, a large Navy base in San Diego. They have to clean their training torpedoes. When I heard about this, I go, wait a minute, torpedoes, those things, don't they blow up during their training? Well, they actually have ones that don't blow up, and they go and retrieve them, bring them back to Point Loma in San Diego, and then they have to clean them out. The fuel inside these torpedoes is very toxic, and they have to use a solvent to clean it out. Mineral spirits is what they use, and it generates a lot of VOC waste as well as reactive waste, so it's pretty nasty stuff. The fuel's like $300 a gallon. It burns underwater, of course, and it's very expensive. Aircraft stripping operations. The Navy has giant aircraft stripping where they strip off coatings with methylene chloride. They're trying to get away from that, and they will have a lot of waste generated from that process. Pharmaceutical manufacturing is the most common one I've seen in San Diego besides the Navy. They have a waste solvent transfer system. So if you're a business designing one for waste solvent, if you're a CUPA inspecting one, a waste solvent transfer system, they're sort of in vogue. I have plans on my desk now from a large biotech wanting to put one in from their labs and production out to their 90-day shed. And they want the county to look at it and see if the required rules, two rules apply. Is it a tank? And they don't want to be a tank system. And the air emission rules apply. So they pay the county for consulting services, and we're looking at the plans. And so they label these plans waste solvent transfer system. We've got several of them in San Diego. These are usually manufacturing companies that are doing manufacturing. Biotechs that are doing manufacturing. They're beyond research and demonstration, usually in research and development. They're usually big piping systems going out to totes or tanks. Solvent waste tote, those are simple. And a wastewater steam stripper, we'll see pictures in a second, very complicated. Several air strippers and steam strippers are subject to this rule if they're treating Rcra hazardous waste. We'll go through that. I've had them at groundwater cleanup locations where they've had air strippers pulling out chlorinated solvents and regulated them under the rule. And then a large fuel storage facility, gasoline waste, gasoline and water, a large fuel terminal in San Diego. Some of the problems we've seen have been open vents at the tank tops, no closure device, not doing inspection monitoring for emissions, no documentation. EPA calls this all, again, low-hanging fruit, which means it's a violation, that's a discrepancy that's very easy to prove if the company has no records. Leaking valves and connectors and pipe runs. It's pretty serious when you're talking about flammable liquids. Leaking pumps, I've seen it, and not aware of the regulation. For my advice to other CUPAs doing this is start slow. If you were to do, graduated enforcement, what CUPAs call it, don't use the hammer approach unless the violator has really got a lot of VOC issues. We had one company that was totally ignoring the rule, never got a CUPA permit, never submitted a business plan. Everything was in play, including the air emissions for that, because they didn't even bother getting any permits through SERS. And so, some general rules with vapors. The higher the vapor pressure, the more volatile. That's obvious. Gasoline, methylene chloride, all those are really high vapor pressures. The vapor pressure of water is 2.3. Compare that to methylene chloride, 45.2. So you can see how, and if you ever used acetone for wiping, it evaporates very quickly. That's the vapor pressure for acetone. The higher the temperature, the higher the vapor pressure. That's a rule, pretty standard rule. And then what a vapor pressure is the measurement above the liquid in a confined system, closed system. Okay. Generators, inspectors, the manifest tells you what kind of waste it is. This is an example, waste flammable liquid, 4,400 pounds. Company that had, again, a waste solvent transfer system, biotech, very large biotech, very well-known biotech in San Diego. All their waste went into these totes in a small room inside the building. It was well above capacity. They were always filling these totes up daily because their manufacturing took off. The product took off after FDA. So they had real problems with vapors. They opened the doors up, and the vapors were really, really bad. The manager said, we're trying to get this moved outside. It's a capital improvement, $1 million plus capital improvement. They wind up doing that. They had done a health safety analysis for workers, and it was health risk assessment, and it was really bad because of, again, methylene chloride as well as some flammable liquids. Okay. They had a wall duct that tried to suck out the vapors. But they had no air district permit. So in San Diego, you can have, for biotech, there's a biotech rule where the Air Pollution Control District, I don't totally want to say I understand their rule in San Diego, but sometimes they'll have a biotech need an air permit, and sometimes they won't. In this case, they didn't require one. That changed, though. After they moved it outside, they no longer had the exemption, I guess, for the Air Pollution Control District, and they had to put in all kinds of special air emission control. At the tank top, little motors, it was not very safe. Flammable vapors, electrical pumps. Just close up on the top of the tank, transfer hoses. And the manager really wanted to get this outside in a big bulk tank. They wind up moving it outside. Instead of totes, they had a 4,000-gallon waste solvent tank with stainless steel piping, double wall, met the rule, spent a lot of money putting it outside. It was much better, much safer to do that. And they met the requirements. Another biotech facility, they put a shed. The cap is open on top, hard to see, but they leave the cap open to let the vapors escape when they're filling it. The headspace has to go somewhere, right? So they left it open. So not only do you have a generator open a container violation, but you have a Subpart CC violation for emissions. Because they leave it open all the time, is apparently what they were doing. Because they had a hose, transfer hose, and then they didn't want to remove the hose every day. Just a close-up on the hose and the loose cap. Very common with VOCs and totes for the companies to leave a cap loose or off for the headspace to go somewhere. And if it's volatile organic, Rcra waste, you got not only open container rule, but you have the air emissions violation as well. Yeah. This company, we didn't do enforcement because we wrote up all the violations, and then they complied. And this was like, 2007, so it was pretty fresh. And a lot of large quantity generators, they're used to 90-day storage requirements, generator basic rules, contingency plans, SIRS now, but they don't get this. So we have to kind of slowly help them. That's why I made the guide. This is the transfer hose. One of the rules you'll see in a little bit is when you're transferring VOC waste from small containers, they had drums and things, into a tote, you can't really have any top loading or what's called splash loading. Because if you're doing it from the top, it's splashing in and all your vapors are kicking out. You have to have submersible entry of the solvent, or liquid, pumping into it. So you have to submerge it down through a pipe or a tube. Makes sense. If you have top splash loading, a lot of VOCs will be escaping. This is the violation we gave for the Lqg. We not only did the generator violation for open container, but we cited they had the 200-gallon tote set up to allow vapors to escape pretty much 24/7. This is a wastewater tank with methylene chloride, F002. So I know it's a Rcra solvent. And they treat the methylene chloride in the wastewater to get the wastewater to meet sewer treatment levels. And then methylene chloride is stripped off and then collected and disposed of as hazardous waste. A lot of piping, waste solvent waste. So if you're an inspector going into a place cold and you see all this, you're not only thinking about hazardous waste tank system standards, but you should be thinking about Subpart CC and Subpart BB. In this case, all three rules, Subpart AA even apply because they had a steam stripper. Manufacturing, the company makes a drug that they sell overseas. They got permission from FDA to sell it in the United States, and it's like a wonder drug it's a narcotic they use for IVs in all kinds of surgeries. And so they took off their product in the last several years. So they manufacturing. They were doing R&D for 20 years, and they got an FDA approval, and they put this whole system in just to treat the wastewater. Because they were continuously making 2 shifts a day this IV drug that was in popular demand. Again, just close up on the markings. If you're an inspector, you see that, you're going to think of tank rules, and you're going to think about the air emission rules. It can be kind of daunting if you're an inspector to have to inspect all the piping. And it's just to show you that for this system, the wastewater had all kinds of piping and pumps, and they had manufacturing vapors coming out here from their reaction vessels where they were making the drug. They had liquids coming from the reactors inside the building. They had wastewater coming from the washing of the reactors. After every batch, they had to clean the reactors that were making the drug in. They had return lines, steam lines, all kinds of piping to deal with. So it can be kind of daunting. I knew it wasn't in compliance. They had nothing marked. All the connectors need to be marked with a metal tag or some kind of a tag indicating the equipment ID number and what kind of VOC waste is in that particular piece of equipment. So I knew right away they weren't in compliance with the Subpart BB rule for piping. They were doing the PE assessment. They had it done for hazardous waste tank systems, double wall, leak detection, secondary containment. But they had no air emissions monitoring, which we'll talk about in more detail. Again, just close-ups. All these are potential leak points for vapors. And the thing about vapors is we're all, as inspectors, we're all used to looking for drips, liquid, or we maybe smell some odors. Here you smelled odors all the time. I mean, they're doing 20,000 gallons of wastewater treatment daily. That's how much waste. So these things can, for volatile waste, they can be leaking and evaporating and never drip to the ground and leave a stain or a wet mark. That's the insidious nature of vapors or vapor loss. So, and methylene chloride being toxic, not flammable, but being pretty toxic. Again, close-ups on pumps, just showing that nothing was marked, lots of connections. Companies spent a lot of money coming into compliance after this. They had to get a consultant, or at least they wanted to get a consultant who had experience in the air emissions rule. This is a steam stripper. They had to strip out the methylene chloride from the wastewater. Now they have 2 towers of steam stripping to strip out the methylene chloride from the water, wastewater. Just to show you. Condensers at the top, which condense the methylene chloride, and then you get liquid, you pump it down to a decanter or another storage tank for waste, which is what this is right here. Had about 200 gallons of spent methylene chloride that was stripped off from the steam stripper. Very expensive, multi-million-dollar wastewater treatment. Refineries are going to have this. Manufacturing facilities are going to have this kind of equipment. LA probably has a lot more than San Diego, I'm pretty sure. Again, just close up on the back side of what they call the decanter, which is their waste methylene chloride, little plastic sight glass. When I see plastic and solvents, I start thinking about compatibility because I used to do emergency response, and I've been, in the old days, a lot of responses where there's been leaks from incompatible materials. Where they put in plastic to convey a solvent, store a solvent, and it just eats away. So I'm really focused on that. Found a lot of problems. And ultimately, from the decanter, it goes in the drums. You see a pretty good VOC system, but nothing's being monitored, nothing's being tagged. So the violations were failing to have a monitoring and inspection plan, failing to identify the waste solvent on paper. They had manifests, that's all they had. And then marking all these connectors with tags. Carbon absorbers are common when you have VOC wastewater or VOC waste from totes. Carbon absorbers are the normal rule for Lqgs in pretty much the whole state. They're simple. The problem with carbon absorbers, there's two types. There's the ones you regenerate with steam. There's ones that you don't regenerate. They go off in a drum or go off every 90 days or when they become spent. This is a steam regenerated one. They're doing so much waste treatment, they just don't want to be getting waste carbon, shutting down for several hours, removing the carbon. So they pump in hot steam, get the methylene chloride to actually vaporize again, go back through a closed loop to the steam stripper. So it's a pretty ingenious system. Expensive, multi-million dollar. Fuel terminal in San Diego. They have oil water separator, really it's fuel water separators in the ground here. From over here, off the picture there, is their loading racks for gasoline tankers. They have a spill, goes into a drain with a lot of water, goes down to the fuel water separator underground, and they have to do something with that wastewater. They don't have a sewer connection for this terminal. So they try not to have spills and overfills at the loading racks for the gasoline terminal. But they have them every day. Ultimately, the wastewater from the oil water separator goes into an 18,000 gallon tank. That's right here. That's the label on it. It's hazardous for benzene and gasoline. Residual. It's not pure product. It's really wastewater with some benzene, Rcra T-clip organic benzene, and then some gasoline. So what I had them do when I saw this, I said, well, how are you venting that 18,000 gallon tank? So they had this vent that looped up and over. I said, do you have an open vent? But first of all, I said, is this a VOC waste? Well, yeah, it's Rcra benzene with benzene and water. I said, well, give me your waste profile, give me your sampling data, things like that. And they gave me the data back. Ultimately, it was below 500 parts per million, so they were not subject to the regulation. They were just barely below, which is a threshold we'll talk about in a little bit. But I bring out a PID, photo ionization detector, held it up here, and I had like 200 parts per million in the vent, and I'm thinking there's got to be 500 parts per million or more down in the tank, and made the generator do a waste classification for volatile organics. So Lqgs are subject to these rules, but Subpart AA, not very common at Lqgs. BB is common at places that have tank systems for VOC waste, and Subpart CC for tanks and containers. No surface impoundments I'm aware of in San Diego or in California, I'd say, but there are tanks and there are containers. And recycling units. Recycling waste, they calculated. The lack of awareness by Lqgs is, and inspectors is pretty high right now, I've seen. A lot of times they'll think, well, the Air Pollution Control District regulates me. Why is the CUPA asking questions about it? But depending on what rule they're complying with the air district, may still be subject to the air emission requirements. The air pollution, the last one I just did a month ago, the consultant and the company came and said, we have an air permit, we're exempt. And I said, well, you have to do this, this, and this to meet the exemption under Rcra, which is pretty much meet the Clean Air Act, the Federal Clean Air Act, which they weren't meeting the Federal Clean Air Act, they were meeting a local rule. So they went back to the drawing board. I'll talk about that more. And inspectors aren't really trained or fully trained, and so we're trying to get the word out. It's authorized by the EPA. States have to do this as part of their Rcra program. And again, for Lqg Rcra, it's usually BB and CC. A lot of exemptions under the federal rule do not apply in California because California does not adopt a lot of the federal exemptions. And they're really specific to equipment, and we'll get into detail about that. And as I mentioned earlier, if it's production solvent vapors, that's not regulated by this rule. It's the waste part of it, the discards from production. Usually the manufacturing, like Air Pollution Control District, that one methylene chloride wastewater, they regulated the heck out of the production area, the reactor vessels and things, where methylene chloride was going in pure concentrations. And all that VOCs from manufacturing had an air permit. But the wastewater, which was trace to the air pollution control, it was trace levels to them, below 1%, but above 500 parts per million, which is the regulatory threshold we're going to be talking about. They go, oh, the CUPA handles, or the inspectors, the county health handles the wastewater. We only handle the vapors from production, manufacturing, coating, and so forth. So there's a loophole in some air districts where they focus on the pure solvent being used, coming off manufacturing, and they don't focus on wastewater with low levels of VOC. If somebody says, Lqg says that they're not subject to the rule, they have to meet, like I mentioned, Clean Air Act, these parts, one of these parts, and their performance standards for stationary sources and national NESHAPs for the bottom. They have to have operating emission control, and they have to have records. Everyone I've done who's verbally said we're exempt because we have an air permit, they don't meet these three. They haven't met one yet. Now in LA, South Coast Air Quality Management District may be tougher, maybe a little bit more looking at the federal, because LA has a little more challenging in air emissions than in San Diego. But in our air district, they don't really look at the parts 60, 61, and 63 of the Clean Air Act. And usually these are major manufacturing, like refineries, chemical manufacturing facilities that have to meet these rules for wastewater, for waste solvents, waste coatings, and fuel production. If there's an exemption that they claim they don't need it because there's an exemption in the federal rules, well, you're not going to get out of Subpart CC if you say, well, I'm exempt from the Clean Air Act. And they have to have emission controls. They can't average out their emissions and so forth. It can be a little challenging for businesses that come in and will say it's not, I'm exempt. But like I said, in 100% of the cases, no one's been exempt. They couldn't. And the biggie is the manager or responsible managing officer of the company has to certify under penalty of perjury, I'm meeting the Federal Clean Air Act. And when they get to that paragraph, they kind of freak back a little bit. Because then they're really putting on the line for the US EPA to come down, do a Clean Air Act inspection. And EPA has been interested in this topic. Region 9 hasn't really done a lot of outreach, but they've been interested in this because I've kind of been pushing it more at the CUPA level, at the higher level. And so they say they're going to make it a priority in the future. of their air toxic initiatives. And again, as I mentioned, sometimes they believe the air permit exempts them. And that certification is a scary thing if the person's just signing it and not really realizing what they're signing. One company was going to do it, but I told them to really think about it because you don't have any equipment ID marked. See, the one thing about the overlap is the Clean Air Act. If you comply with the Clean Air Act, the same rule applies. So that's the exemption where you can not have to meet Subpart BB because you're already meeting the overlap rule. So the equipment has to be marked. You have to have a monitoring plan, inspection schedule, and when they don't have it, they're not meeting the Federal Clean Air Act. So it's something that needs to be looked at. The key thresholds are 10 parts per million by weight for AA. Subpart BB is your leak detection and repair. It's greater than 10% by weight. And Subpart CC for tanks, containers, 500 parts per million by weight. So the AA is your air and steam strippers. That's what that regulates, process vents from that. BB is your piping and pumps and valves, your piping runs. And CC is the end, which is your tank or containers that have a VOC waste. A little bit nuance about A and BB. The total organic concentration, where CC is an average, volatile organic. The biggest issue is when I ask for the waste determination from the generator, they'll give you a profile, they'll give you a manifest, and it may work, but this rule actually has a waste determination regulation in it. It says you shall determine your organic concentration for your volatile waste and keep records of it by knowledge or by testing. We'll go through that in more detail in a second. And if any changes, they need to update it. The ones that have done sampling, I tell them that be careful in the sampling because if they do it wrong, you have a lot of volatile organics escape, if they're doing it with not in a measured manner. If they're just throwing it into a jar with a lot of headspace, the volatile organics will escape. So there's actually a certain unique way of sampling volatile organics with minimized bubbles, zero headspace, and use the right sample jar. It's totally critical. I mean, they can't just use a mason jar or a big 16-ounce jar that we're used to doing in the CUPAs when we take samples. Got to be representative. If they sample the waste not at the point of generation, that's not representative. It's got to be at the point of generation, not in a consolidation tank, down gradient. So they can demonstrate compliance through record keeping, implementation. Employee training is important. The employee that's assigned to go out there and do the leak detection and vapor monitoring. And they can kind of do it at the same time doing their tank system inspection, if they can. Subpart AA is really, for Lqgs, it's air or steam stripping. These waste treatment for solvent, not very common at Lqgs. Some may have distillation for solvent recycling on site. These are typically TSD facility operations or bigger facilities. And again, 10 parts per million is not a lot to be subject to Subpart AA. That's very little in the waste. But it's got to be Rcra waste, again, just to emphasize that. The definition of process vent in AA, pretty much an open stack, open pipe, needs to have a control device or a closure device. I'll give examples of that in a little bit. When it's associated with that solvent treatment or VO treatment. The biggest thing about AA with the steam strippers and air strippers is they have to have control devices on all their process vents. Nothing can be open, evaporating 24/7 to the air. Now the rest of because AA is so not very common, I'm going to focus on BB and CC, which is very common at Lqg Rcra generators. But again, that's for tanks, containers, and piping with volatile organic waste. BB is called the LDAR, Leak Detection and Repair Program. So it makes the generator inspect for leaks and repair them. They have an active program in place, meeting basic requirements in the rule. And really, the whole idea is to make sure the facility is, cares about their vapors, about vapor loss and leak detection. Because again, if something is leaking and weeping very slowly from a pump or from a valve or a connector, and it's highly volatile, you don't see a drip. You may smell it, but there's no sign of leakage if it's a very highly volatile and you got like a weep occurring. So this program captures those leaks using monitoring. Again, Rcra Lqg, and then 10% for Subpart BB. So that's a much higher concentration of volatile organics for Subpart BB rule, 10% or more. And for anything that's flammable liquid waste, and you look at, the thing about SIRS is now for waste, they put the composition or components and percentages in SIRS. I can look at a SIRS, see their Rcra Lqg, look at their inventory in SIRS, see the waste composition, and before I even get in my car to drive to a facility, kind of have an idea do they have more or less than 10% VOC in their reported waste in SIRS. SIRS has been a really good tool, as well as the hazardous waste tracking system that regulators have access to. Best. All this equipment is part of the BB rule. Pumps, compressors, devices, sampling connection systems, open-ended valves, flanges, and all those things at the bottom, the pumps, the valves, etc., they all kind of are common at Lqgs. There are some exemptions in BB, less than 300 hours a year for the piping, equipment's in vacuum service, and of course SQGs are exempt and non-Rcra is not regulated. The 300-hour thing, one of my generators said we use our piping intermittently, and so we added up through the whole year, and it's like 200 hours. I forget the actual number. And I said, well, you look at the Federal Register about this rule, and EPA says to get an exemption for BB for the 300-hour rule, after you finish your intermittent transfer of waste solvent to your tank, you have to then flush it with a clean material and decontaminate it. If you don't decontaminate it, the 300-hour rule is not going to work, because they want you to decontaminate the piping run between intermittent use in order to use that 300 hours or less. They weren't doing it, and so the 300-hour rule didn't work for the company that said, hey, we're exempt, we're less than 300 hours, and you got to flush it through and clean it. The idea being, EPA, when they made the rule, they gave the reasons why you decontaminate the piping and clean flush. It made sense when you read the rule. Each piece of equipment in BB has different monitoring standards. For light liquid service, which is more highly volatile waste versus a heavy liquid, we'll talk about in a minute, you got to do a monthly monitoring and then visually check weekly. And then 10,000 parts per million on a PID, photoionization detector. So the money to comply with this rule for a business, you got to have a PID, employee training, PID calibration, tag all your different piping run and all your valves, connectors, pumps, etc. So there's a lot of upfront money as well as continuous money that has to be spent if you're dealing with this rule. So businesses don't like this rule, but if they're in, they're in, and they would have to get away from the thresholds and the volatile organics. Pressure relief devices, again, just measuring it to see with a PID typically, and repair it. Pressure relief devices, other states have done this rule much more than California, believe it or not. Illinois, Indiana, Texas, even Louisiana, which doesn't regulate a lot, and because there's a lot of chemical manufacturing. And they find that pressure relief devices don't seat completely after they get old, especially on outdoor equipment. And when they don't seat, they're just evaporating. They're not sealing. And so they stay open, because the weather extremes in that part of the country are usually hot and cold and heavy rains and outdoor harsh environment, versus us, we struggle with our weather every day, being too beautiful. Waste sampling connections. You can't just have an open sampling connection. For BB, you can't have any open-ended valves or lines. So if you have a terminal valve at the end of the terminus valve at the very end of a piping run, you have to have at the end of that valve, you have to have a cap as well at the end of that on the exit side of the valve. Just can't keep them open. Because what happened was EPA had to do a study to make this rule and show there's a lot of vapor loss occurring at connections, at valves, at pumps, and they came up with the standards to stop the vapor loss. The unique thing about hazardous waste vapor loss is, this is a given. Industry cares about losing product vapor. They really do. I mean, that's money. That's money in the air. But the waste side of things, sometimes the industry doesn't have the same push to control the vapors. Because if you're losing fresh solvent, you're going to lose money. But on the waste side, it's something that's sometimes not remembered, that you have to comply with the rule as well. Valves and gas vapor or light liquid service, again, a highly volatile, more volatile liquid. The leak threshold's pretty high. When I first read the rule, 10,000 parts per million, but really a PID, 10,000 parts per million, you're out there sometimes outside the facility, in the back of the facility, using the PID. They didn't make the threshold really low. I mean, the capability of the equipment, the situation, operational situation of the equipment. So 10,000 parts per million is realistic. I've used the PID, and you know when you have something highly volatile in a headspace, the PID just climbs dramatically. But vapor leaks and things like that are a little bit harder to spot. Usually a person's nose will detect a vapor before the PID. If you have an unsafe to monitor, difficult to monitor, a company said, hey, I'm not climbing on the steam stripper and looking at those valves every month with a PID. So they can write in their own monitoring and inspection plan, unsafe to monitor, difficult to monitor, and put a frequency that less frequently than monthly. They can say once a year, but they have to put it on paper and justify why. What I tell them to do is look at the valve manufacturer or the condenser manufacturer and make sure that they buy off on your monitoring less frequently and justify it. And everything else for Subpart BB, again, you have to use your visual, audible, olfactory, your nose for leak detection. You got to make repairs quickly, within 15 days. If you can't get the pieces of repair equipment, you have to put in your log, I ordered it, it's going to take 30 days to get here. If it's not a really bad, unsafe leak, it's 11,000 parts per million of something, and it's not a safety issue or fire issue, you can justify it, you're okay for the most part. But if it's a highly toxic vapor coming out, the fire department, air pollution, and even the CUPA will probably say, do you need to shut down that piece of equipment? And the company will say, we can't shut down. We're going to have 45 people lose their jobs for a month while we wait for the equipment to come from, Germany or something. So they have to if they justify it and it's not as safe, it can be allowed to go more than 15 days. As I mentioned, just document if there's unavoidable delay. A lot of record keeping is required. As I mentioned, the equipment ID numbers or tags, the location of it, type of equipment, the percentage of the VO in the waste equipment. Is it 5%? Is it 20% in a valve, volatile organic? And they just document it all. So the company that I'm working with right now, they know this rule. They're figuring out which vapors, which liquids are going to which area, which piping runs, how much VO waste is in that piping run versus another piping run, and they're all documenting it. And they're making the engineer calculate all that out as part of the specs. Building it from scratch is much better to do it than after building it and, of course, getting it inspected. And if you have a leak, you even have to tag it. That makes sense. And record everything. Now we're going to Subpart CC, the last part, which is tanks and containers. A really good training website EPA has on Subpart CC and tanks containers. Think about tanks. You can have breathing losses from the daily temperature changes. Normal, just they call it the tank breathing. Headspace is going up. Headspace is getting hot, getting cold. Liquid's getting hot and cold. Think about a waste VO waste tank in Imperial County in the summer versus a tank in Santa Barbara. The extreme is probably 40 degrees, 35 degrees or something. So a hot steel tank in a desert is going to evaporate much more normal breathing loss through an open vent. And working losses are vapors that are coming as you're filling the tank up. Vapor. Again, Rcra waste is what we're talking about, and 90-day generators. And this is the, businesses will say, where does it say I have to comply with air emissions? It's in the accumulation requirement, 34A1. Again, 500 parts per million by weight, not a lot, triggers this rule for VO containing waste. California does have these exemptions, though, for Subpart CC that apply. Satellite containers, just normal generator rule apply. You don't have to have closure device. You don't have to have control devices on satellite. Of course, Sqgs and squeegees. If it's a small container, it's exempt from the rule. Mixed wastes, units enclosure, universal waste. If you have a federally compliant, and Rcra empty. For your concentration of volatile organics, you can do it by sampling or by process knowledge. The rule actually says 4 samples if you're going to use sampling. So what does the industry usually do? They usually use knowledge. For an inspector, a little more challenging if the business says, my knowledge is it's 400 parts per million by weight, but the inspector is like, I'm not buying it. So what you have to do, if the company insists that they're below 500, you got to sample and prove them wrong, and then because you had to do all that extra enforcement, in San Diego County, it's a graduated enforcement to the very top because the business was wrong. The environmental manager was totally not getting the hint that maybe they should do 4 samples, and you can see it. I mean, you can really see it. If the waste has a lot of volatile organics in it, and the manifests are showing it, and the profile shows it, LDRs are showing it. I try and convince the manager, the paperwork is showing higher VO concentration than 400, and sometimes it's sort of the ostrich in the ground, head in the ground. The methods are, there's lots of methods for VO testing. EPA likes 25D because they think it's one of the better ones for doing a waste sample test for VO concentration. And here's the reasons why. 25D, that's really an air VOC rule. Our lab will do it, not the county lab. We have a contract lab. I think it's $300 a test to do it. Point of waste origination is key. They got to do it where the waste is first generated. For tanks and containers, pretty much the same rules apply. You're carrying about 500 parts per million. You got to know the vapor pressure. This is important because for tank level 1, which we'll cover in a minute, the controls that go along with that rule versus level 2, which are higher standard of emission control, you got to know your vapor pressure. You can do it by knowledge or testing. There's actually a test for vapor pressure that can be done. Sometimes they've done the 500 parts per million and they've documented it in the facility record, but they haven't done the vapor pressure determination, which is that second step you have to do. And that's I'll tell business, you got to do it by knowledge or by testing. Your choice, as long as you're right, whatever choice you pick. I haven't had to sample and do that because most companies, they've gone ahead and estimated the vapor pressure to be very high because the methylene chloride is 80% or something like that, and they can pretty much use safety data sheets and go from there. There's something unique about light liquids material in bigger tank containers, I should say. We'll talk about it a little bit. And non-detectable emissions, we'll talk about. Again, if they certify that they meet the Clean Air Act, Federal Clean Air Act, which is NESHAPS or New Source Performance Standard, which are pretty tough standards, and they certify that, they may be exempt from Subpart CC. I haven't had anybody do that. Of course, San Diego is not like LA with a lot of manufacturing. We just have waste solvent transfer systems, and we have the Navy, for the most part, that I've seen. I'm going to do an outreach to our local industry group in San Diego, but the first thing I heard back when I offered to do the presentation, not 2 hours, but an hour about this, a lot of them say, oh, we're not subject to that rule. We don't want to come. So we're trying to get out to the big manufacturing in San Diego, which are building engines and painting engines, and I think it's the ostrich sort of scenario, and it's not good because we're doing our best to get this out. I put this online 2 years ago. I put the guide online 3 years ago, so hopefully we can use the soft method of getting compliance. Again, process knowledge, as long as they have the right answer, it's correct. So the 2 levels for tank vapor controls. Level 1 is really easy. It's really a closure device. Talk about that in a second. Level 2 is more extensive for tanks or containers. Level 2 is a control device. So the 2 devices that are common in the rule are closure devices, which mean you have something that's closing every time the tank is done being filled or having stuff going into it. Or you have a control device where the vent is open-ended, going to carbon, for example, which is very common. So the difference is closure, and control actually allows the open vent going to like activated carbon to absorb it. Level 2 is expensive. It's activated carbon, it's thermal flares, burning off vapors, it's condensers, it's all kinds of elaborate, very expensive air pollution control devices. Harder to inspect. I've had level 1 mostly in Lqgs, because they want to keep their tanks closed, not have an open vent. But I have one I'm working on now where they built it wrong, and they have an open vent scenario, and I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do about that one with them. Tanks are challenging because you got to know the vapor pressure. And some businesses are like, what's that? Conservation vents, we'll talk about that. They stay open. And then they get mixed up between CC and BB. If you have piping going to the tank, it's BB. What's in the tank is CC. Sometimes they'll say, my tank doesn't have more than 10% waste organics. And I'm like, well, the tank rule is 500 parts per million, which is really low. You're mixing up your BB piping threshold. Oh, okay, someone told me it was 10%. You guys care if it's in the tank. We care, because that's above 500, but 500 parts per million is the threshold. And then inspection, access, and safety, inspecting control devices, and record keeping, or the lack thereof. That's biggie for safety. We can't climb on top of these tanks, so we have to look at records. Vapor pressure is a key determination, as I mentioned, between level 1 and level 2. You got to know it by knowledge or testing. If you go to level 2, emission controls, it could be $8,000 to $10,000 annual cost to meet CC. Because you're having a control device. You have activated carbon. You have to get rid of that. You have to monitor it. You have extra piping for the vapors from the tank that is actually leaving the tank. And that's usually a high production facility. Places that are generating every 90 days a lot of waste solvent. In my cases, every one of them has been like a weekly pickup. For my waste solvent guys at biotechs, they get the 4,000 gallon, one company called Illumina. I'm not going to, because they're really good compliant. Illumina is in San Diego. They're like a multi-billion-dollar company. They, every week, 4,000 gallons of waste solvent. And they know they're on the radar because they have so much waste being generated. So I tell them, like, you guys really need to look at this rule, and they're well ahead of the game. Conservation vents are very easy on a tank. They're a valve that sits on top of the vent, on the tank top, and they allow, when the tank is being filled, for the headspace to go somewhere. Closes right after the tank is being filled. So it conserves the vapors, hence conservation vent. Required to prevent, of course, overpressurization of the tank. You can't have the headspace, has to go somewhere when you're filling it. And there again, they conserve the contents. Very common with them. With the vents, if they aren't inspected annually, which is the rule for level 1, sometimes they don't seat properly, especially if they're outdoor tanks exposed to sunlight, heat, weather extremes, rain. Manufacturers sometimes for the conservation vent will say once a year, check the gasket, check the seals. Got to do it. It's part of the rule. Because again, with weather extremes on an outdoor tank, a lot of times they cracked gaskets, cracked seats, or they won't seat properly. Okay. Level 1's most common, like I mentioned. Can't have a tank that's heated. I don't see that. Heating waste tanks, unless they're doing distillation, which is extremely rare. I usually see small container units. They can't do waste stabilization in a tank for level 1. If they're doing anything in a tank other than collecting waste, they're doing stabilizing, they're doing treatment, they're doing heating of the waste. I've seen heating of the waste once where a company had a very viscous waste and they heated it in order to achieve pumping. That got them into a little bit of VO issues when they heated it, to allow pumping. Tank level 1 is also called a fixed roof. And again, they're inspecting the openings to make sure everything's closed and properly being maintained. And here's like a picture of kind of a tank. Everything's closed on top. Typically, there'll be a pressure relief valve and a conservation vent or something. But if there's an open vent or an open manhole, that's a problem. Some companies have been caught where they leave the manhole partly open during the summer, so allow the waste to evaporate. Not in California, but in other parts of the country. EPA's caught them. Because they can allow the waste to be evaporating on a hot day in Texas. Your waste reduction is your... Yeah, really. Common problems for level 1 tank inspections. Closure devices have been left open, the hatches, caps, bolts are missing. And I got lots of pictures from other inspectors in other parts of the country that are doing this, that are showing these problems. And EPA has it on their website. And conservation vents that go bad. Tank level 1, or tank level 2, if you can't meet level 1, which is a closed tank or a conservation vent, you go to level 2, where you have a control device. Tank level 2 are typically, you'll see them vented like that one that was venting to a carbon drum. That's level 2 control. If it's pressurized waste tank, probably level 2 is needed. If they have a tank in an enclosure with a combustion flare on top to burn off the vapors from a tank vent, that thermal destruction unit is level 2. Internal floating roofs, haven't seen any in San Diego for waste. See it for gasoline. And then external floating roof. Not very common in my neck of the woods. Vapor recovery units for level 2, you can have a condenser. Typically on the top of an air stripper or steam stripper, it'll condense out the volatile organics. And activated carbon, very common at Lqg Rcra. The most common issue is the used carbon. The spent carbon is not changed out frequently enough, and they get breakthrough Breakthrough meaning that the vapors are going right through the activated carbon, right out through the exit port on the activated carbon drum or unit, right out to the air. And you may not smell it, because a lot of times these stacks go up to rooftops, so you're not going to smell it. So you have to kind of like just use your knowledge, use your experience, and ask questions. Subpart CC, the last part for containers, there's level 1 easiest. All it is keep your Rcra container closed. Pretty much that's it for level 1. Level 1 are containers below 121 gallons and below. Drums, for example. 122 gallons, excuse me. Keep them closed. If you have level 2, which are like the big giant tote picture I showed earlier in the presentation, level 2 controls no splash loading from the top, and you got to keep them closed. And you have to have a closure device or control device on these bigger totes, bigger containers. Level 3 is people that are treating volatile organic waste in containers larger than 20, but I have not seen that. It's waste stabilization, where they actually have a volatile organic waste and they're putting in stabilizing, curing material to cure or stabilize the waste, fix it, almost like cement. Not very common. Again, containers, they can visually inspect them for leaks, no problem. No additional records unless using level 3, which is your treatment containers for VO waste. I haven't seen it, and it's very rare. Very, very easy to meet it if you keep the container closed. But that last bullet is kind of important. I've seen it where they keep the tote open, at least the cap open. Because as they're filling it, the headspace has to go somewhere, or there'll be back pressure, and then they're going to have a problem at the pump that's pumping waste to the big tote. So I've seen ones, we had a groundwater treatment system stripping out chlorinated solvents. They left open the hatches on 3 totes, and hot day. Downwind was the Army Reserve Station where their recruits were coming and doing, every month they come in for a weekend or something. Well, they came in and they got that chlorinated smell that made them nauseous. 911, we all go running out there. And, these are Army Reserve guys. And they're all not feeling. Some are feeling worse than others as they puff on their cigarettes. And then everybody came because they thought it was an attack. FBI showed up because they had seen the report. They thought somebody was attacking the Army Reserve with some kind of a toxic gas. Turned out to be the groundwater remediation system that was treating groundwater with chlorinated solvents, TCE, TCA, highly volatile, very odorous, and they weren't meeting the tote standard. They were not meeting it. They kept them open. They had I wish I had a picture of it. I didn't bring it, but they had the cap left off, and they had a little bucket on top of to cover the cap. Vent devices on drums are allowed as long as they're working and kept closed. Of course, if they have open lid or open cap, violation. Again, very easy to meet level 1 controls for containers. I haven't seen anybody use vapor suppression barrier for level 1. The example I just gave with the military reserve, they were thinking about it because it turned out it happened really early in the morning 3 times. The third time, when the guy came to pump out the totes, the waste hauler, they came out with a vacuum truck that didn't have a carbon absorber. So as he was sucking it out, all those vapors were going into the wind and getting the guys downwind. They were about yards away. With that, that really harsh smell of chlorinated solvent. So it was the transporter that came with the wrong truck. So if you're in a business of generating waste and you got a VOC waste, you have a transfer occurring from totes or drums or tanks, whatever, and you make sure they come with a vacuum truck that has some kind of a emission control on it. Because if it's not a used oil truck you want showing up out, you want to have something that has emissions. Because downwind is when the 911 calls occur. And we've been out on a few of those. Okay. Again, DOT container is fine, which is allowed for container. Containers are easy for this rule. Got to be a DOT container. So if the DOT container is not spec'd for that volatile organic waste, it doesn't meet the DOT container requirement. As I just mentioned. For level 2, again, you got to have a container that meets DOT, usually a bigger container, more than 122 gallons. No emissions can be detected, and vapor tight. Usually this is all TSDFs or transporters. A transporter with a truck, a vacuum truck, is regulated by container level 2. They're not exempt from the requirements, air emissions requirements. Matter of fact, they're the ones that need to be mostly closely watched for if there's any odor complaints or emission complaints during transfer. They can't have splash loading in a tote if it's a large tote with VOC, because again, the vapors just come right out that splash loading port. You got to have it down. Level 3, typically a TSDF. A TSDF that is getting totes coming to them, and they're in an industrial area, there's neighbors around. They may have an enclosure where they'll open up that tote and they will do all the sampling they want to do and all that transfer they want to do. And they have to have an enclosure with a combustion control device or an activated carbon unit or some kind of enclosure that will exhaust out. Because if you're sitting in the middle of LA and you're transferring hazardous waste from totes to your TSDF, if you don't have any kind of a closure device or enclosure, people downwind are probably going to complain and call. And they got to do the transfer carefully. And then the enclosure, there's actually a very, very tough rule to meet. But a TSD will meet that rule in order to get a permit. If they're opening up totes all day long, pumping them out, and then treating the VO waste or bulking the VO waste, that's their business. And they'll meet I haven't seen any generator build an enclosure. One company talked about it, but they didn't. The cost is so high. And lastly, in San Diego, we hired a dog to detect VOs. Volatile organics. He works cheap for dog biscuits. And that is pretty much it. And the last slide for the presentation is, if you're a business with VO waste, the liability and risk is very high. And you can see what's happening up in Hanford, big lawsuit, a lot of workers complain. Workers will complain to OSHA, but sometimes it leads into Rcra because it's dealing with hazardous waste. You can have fire, worker exposures, and those kinds of issues. They're very more intricate. We have a guide, as I mentioned, and there are a lot of good online tools and guides that are available. So, with that, any questions? It's a little complicated. I find it really interesting because I'm kind of moving on to something more challenging, and this is a challenging rule to implement. So my advice as inspectors is look at it, assist the business, show them where the guides are. The ones that are truly, you got odor complaints on, you go out multiple times on odor complaints, and they're not fixing the problem. Look at this rule. It may not just be a generator failed to keep the container or tank closed, or it may be this. And so you'll look at these rules and apply them. That's it. Thank you, guys. Thanks.